I showed up to the party with a 4-pack of Doom Bar Amber Ale, a 4-pack of Stella, and a bottle of Shiraz. That should have been enough for almost everything. I wasn't invited, but my best friend Brian was going to come with his longtime girlfriend Claire. So he asked me to go with him. He actually called me and asked if I could come to the party and watch Claire. He was having problems at work and was going to be late. He didn't like leaving her alone with all the office Lotharios. I was lonely at that moment. It was a birthday party for a girl from Claire's office. She worked as a secretary for a local solicitor, one of the few, so it was assumed there would be 1 or 2 single girls there. Oh, and it was cheaper to go to a blowout party than a pub on a Saturday night. The front door was open, so I walked in and, leaving my drinks in the kitchen, which was full of men and beer, headed out to find Claire. I saw her talking to a guy in the corner of the living room. I saw him shrug and walk away. When I approached her, she smiled at me and said, "I'm glad you're here. Brian's going to be a little late. Some broken down van or something." I told her I knew about it since he had asked me to keep her company. She touched my arm. "Thanks for that. They keep trying to get me to talk. Could you get me a drink, please? I don't want to go into the kitchen. It's like entering a lion's den." Brian worked as a transportation manager for a local delivery firm and called me, saying he would be late because he was going to either fix the van or reload the load into another one so the driver could finish the delivery. He's coming over as soon as he can, so could I look after Claire until he gets here? He was a little nervous about her being alone. It was a party for a girl she knew from work, so it shouldn't be a problem. She'd be able to find someone to talk to. I figured he was a little paranoid, but whatever. He's my buddy, he asked, and I'll do it. Brian and I have been friends since we went to elementary school at the age of 4, which is almost 22 years ago, and we've helped each other all that time. He helped me through my first heartbreak when I saw my then-girlfriend Sharon making out with Charlie. He said we weren't exclusive, and it was actually Charlie's 7th birthday party. I helped him when he didn't make the soccer team when he was 13 in grammar school, and the sports master told him to come back next year when he was taller, healthier, and faster. I sympathized with him, and we started going jogging together. The next year, he made the soccer team and found that he enjoyed running too. Running also helped me get a place as a forward on the school rugby team. Over the years, we got into a few scrapes, mostly over broken windows and being late for lessons because we farted. Setting fire to the trash can behind the sports pavilion when we tried our first cigarette didn't please the principal. A 2-week suspension plus extra homework on lung cancer research made us both give up smoking for life. The bullies decided it wasn't worth taking on 2 of us, and after a while they left us alone. College came along. Brian studied business, and I studied accounting. During college, we continued to play sports. I called him Ponzi because he would run around kicking a ball and falling down as if in pain. He called me a chubby Neanderthal because I would run around and throw myself at other men. And honestly, most of the players I play with definitely look like Neanderthals. Through all this exercise, Brian and I became pretty fit. Brian got a job as an assistant transportation manager, which really meant office dog body and driver when needed. I got a job as an assistant accountant at a local engineering firm, which meant an office dog body and someone who could use a calculator and do simple, boring work. Then cars and beer were added to the girls. Endless days of fun for 2 young guys in good physical shape. Over the years, the company found that Brian had a knack for organization, finding ways to expand the business and work more efficiently. After a few years, he was promoted to deputy transportation manager. I found that the wrong numbers just jumped off the pages at me, either by mistake or on purpose to hide something, and after a few years I became deputy chief accountant. I called him a van balancer, couldn't think of anything worse, and he called me a bean-shuffling Neanderthal, which wasn't far from the truth. Then he met Claire, but that was normal. It was always going to happen. We always knew that one day we would meet the girl of our dreams, and everything would change. We talked about it. I just hoped that I would be the one to be the first to find the woman I would spend the rest of my life with. I liked Claire. She was right for him. He wasn't as reckless. He was more down to earth. It didn't hurt that she was very good looking. 5 foot tall, long black straight hair split down the middle, She was very pretty, and when she smiled, it lit up her whole face. I know I shouldn't do this, but I have to say, the body looked pretty good too. They dated for a little over 2 years. She had moved in with Brian about 6 months ago, but I had heard rumors that she hadn't sold her apartment, but was just renting it out. I didn't often get the chance to talk to Claire alone, so I asked the question that had been on my mind for a while. So when are you two getting married? Subtlety wasn't my strong suit. She looked a little embarrassed. Brian's been dropping hints, but I keep telling him I'm not ready yet. She looked at me as if she'd given away some secret. Don't get me wrong, I really love him. He's kind, considerate, sweet, funny, and very, very nice. I felt something was missing, something she wasn't telling me. So why haven't you made a date yet? I've known him for the last 20 plus years. He's a great guy, a great buddy. And I'm looking forward to being best man so I can mess around with some of your bridesmaids. She got a little serious and I tried to lighten the mood. It didn't work. We were standing in a corner so it was quiet. She turned to face me and put her hand on my arm. Dave. She looked me straight in the eye. It was a little unnerving. I've known you for a few years now, so I know you can keep a secret, but as great as Brian is, there's something missing. Now I was confused. I had seen these two together for the last couple years. They were amazingly perfect for each other. It seemed like they could always tell what the other was thinking. I never know what a woman is thinking, even when she tells me what she's thinking. It's just, well, he is. Damn, this is so embarrassing. Of course, do you have girlfriends to talk to about stuff like that? Oh God, no, I know what they'd say right now. But they're not in love with him. And at least you're his best friend. I put my hand over hers. Look, you can trust me. I love you like family. Anything I can do to help. I don't know if you can. It's just, hell, he's not very good, she whispered. I only got more confused. What do you mean? She raised her eyes to the ceiling. You mean, oh, you mean? I discreetly pointed my finger upstairs where the bedrooms were and then whispered. You mean in the bedroom? She nodded her head. She stood up a little straighter, as if a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. Can you think of anything? What? How the hell should I know? To hell with it. Have you tried talking about it? Tried, but he keeps shutting up. I'm sorry, but I need more. David, I know you can keep a secret. Is there anything you can do to help me? She put her hand on my arm. I shook it off and took a step back like I'd been stung. Well, shit. Hang in there. I'm his comrade. She looked embarrassed now, but then she smiled. No, no, silly boy. I don't mean that. I like you a lot. A lot. I mean, you can talk to him. Enlighten him. Rumor has it you're not bad. Phew, I was relieved. I don't have fun with married women. Well, only once. Okay. Several times with the same one. But it wasn't my fault. She hadn't told me she was married, and she wasn't wearing any rings, and I certainly don't sleep with my buddy's girlfriend. I don't know. I've never been asked that before. It's awkward, but what's the big deal, really? There were tears in her eyes. I love him, but I need more of him, if you know what I mean. That's so unrealistic. I need more beer, and you probably need more wine. I'm not enough for 2 cocktails. I just needed time to think. I sent Brian a quick text to see how long he was going to be and got a reply that he was on his way to their apartment to change because he was dirty. He'd be there in about 20 minutes, maybe less. That gave us 10 minutes to chat and 5 minutes for Claire to come to her senses. I went back and handed her the drink. She drank half of it in one go. She told me that she got a text from Brian that he would be in 15 minutes or so. I told her, We've got 10 minutes, so it might be a bit rough. He's winding you up, isn't he? Yes, but only about half the time. And it's over within 5, 10 minutes? No long, slow, leisurely screws? About that? I sensed she was about to say something else, but held back. I had too much information in my head as it was. She touched my arm lightly. If you could get him to talk about it, that would be a start. Okay, I'll go get him a beer for when he gets here, and you go fix your makeup, and I promise you I'll think about it. I realized why she couldn't talk to her girlfriends. They'd just say dump him and find someone else. But she loves him. Okay, thanks. She looked at me, put her hand on my shoulder, and kissed my cheek. You're like the big sister I can chat with that I never had. I spread my hands up and down her body, towering over her by at least 3 inches. Big sister. Okay, the big brother I can chat with but never had. I'm going to have to start calling you Big Brother. She left to go to the bathroom to fix her makeup. I went and got a few bottles of beer. 2 for Brian since he was standing behind us and he would probably need a beer. He got there before Claire got back from the restroom. On his way through the kitchen, he grabbed 2 mugs of beer. He took one for me so we couldn't shake hands. They were full of beer. I had to fake a manly hug with beer in hand. At this point, Claire reappeared, and I tried to hold on to the 4 beers while he hugged her and kissed her. He apologized for being late and thanked me for taking care of his girlfriend. He invited me out for a beer on Monday after rugby practice to make amends for leaving her to her own devices. I told him it was no problem. I liked her. All for a friend. But since he was buying beer, I was fine with it. He said he would have been later, but when they were halfway through moving the load from one van to the other, the mechanic managed to get the first van started. So instead of putting everything back, he split the delivery notices in half and sent 2 drivers. They could make up the time and possibly finish the job sooner. Now he was here, and I was to walk around town and try to find available girls. I chatted with a few girls, managed to dance with a few, and even got a few kisses. I exchanged a few phone numbers, promising that I would call them, but my heart wasn't in it. It was about 11:30 when Brian and Claire came and found me to tell me they were going home. Brian was leaving for a course on Tuesday, so they had things to do. Brian grinned his stupid grin and winked at me. Oh boy. They asked if I wanted to take a cab, since they lived near me. I declined. Let the lovebirds drive and have fun. Well, at least one of them did. I stayed until the party died down and walked home, still a little embarrassed. I met Brian at the pub around 7:30 on Monday. He dragged me to a table instead of standing at the bar like we usually did. He pounced on me without any preamble. I think Claire is seeing someone else. Shit. Why do you think that? Well, she wants to have more fun and try other things. I thought we were doing okay. We do it 2 or 3 times a week, but she wants more. Sorry, buddy. I don't see the problem with that. I don't know. I can't see what the big deal is. I told him the story of Kathy, a married woman who used me as a boy toy. Oh, I wasn't complaining about being used as a boy toy. My complaint was that she told me she was divorced, but she wasn't. He was in the Navy and away a lot. Apparently, that's why she always came to me, and I didn't come to her. I found this out when she came to see me one day and forgot to take off her wedding ring. This was back in the days when I didn't check for a white band or dent on the 3rd finger of my left hand. Along with that, I gave him some tips on how to improve his sex life. I went to the bar. I know he said he would pay, but I needed to stretch my legs and think about something else. While I was at the bar, I hatched a cunning plan. When I got back, I suggested to Brian that since he was going away for a couple weeks and coming home for the weekend, it would be a good time to do some research. I suggested he use this time to use his laptop and Google stuff like how to improve your life or how to drive women crazy. Then another idea occurred to me. While he was away and I had a few hours of flexible schedule that I had to use or lose, I would discreetly keep an eye on Claire on her lunch break. She goes to a hotel near where she works, and she was a member of a gym, so I could check to see if anything interesting was going on there. I could also keep an eye on their apartment. I happily agreed to this because I was pretty sure she wasn't doing anything. He seemed to like the idea and calmed down. We both went home satisfied, and not just because of the beer. He had a plan to improve her life, and then she would probably marry him. And I gave him peace of mind. I gave my 2 best friends hope. I did what I had promised Brian. I went to the hotel on Tuesday lunchtime, found a quiet corner, saw Claire arrive and headed to the pool, and went straight to the gym on Wednesday. Thursday was different, and it alarmed me. She walked in and went straight to the elevator. It was going up to the fourth floor. There was no way I could get up there to see where she went. It was a little over an hour later when she got off the elevator at the same time as the young man. It didn't look like they were together. They didn't seem to notice each other, didn't talk to each other. Moreover, it seemed as if they were studiously ignoring each other. The young man headed for the counter, and Claire walked out of the hotel. A little wrong, I thought. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up for no apparent reason. Saturday night, all three of us gathered at the pub, and I received a few mild chides from Claire for not calling any of the girls in her office. It turned out that I had been in thinking mode, trying to help my friends, imagining myself as a dark, silent, handsome, mysterious man that some of the girls in her office wanted to explore. Bullshit. I was just thinking about my buddies. But let's use this, Claire suggested, and Shirley felt a little more cheerful. I had her number, and I made a date with her for Sunday night. While Brian sat at the bar pouring drinks, Claire leaned over to me and said, "I don't know what you said to him last week, but last night was definitely better. There's still a lot of work to be done, but he even seems to want to talk about it. Although I thought I heard him say, Her Royal Highness Queen Elizabeth II at some point in the game." Sunday morning, I went to watch Brian play soccer. Claire was there as usual. I stood next to her, not too close. She's not my girlfriend, but she's nice to be around. Not too insistently, I asked if it was getting better. She gave me a leering look, smiled, and said, "He talks about all sorts of nonsense, thanks." Brian caught me at the bar after the match while Claire was powdering her nose. "Hey, mate, thanks for the advice. A Google search on how to improve my life led me to a whole bunch of women's magazines. Not what I expected. Hell, women are weird. Looks like they want to talk. Either way, I have nothing to lose. If I want to marry her, I'll have to give it a go." "Thanks, buddy. You should take your own advice." I replied in my usual buddy manner, "Back off, asshole." On Tuesday, I felt guilty about going to the hotel on my lunch break, but Claire went straight to the pool and then to the gym on Wednesday. I still didn't like Thursday, so I arrived fairly early and saw a young man get off the elevator with Claire and head to the front desk. I got an uneasy feeling. I entered the elevator with him. We went up to the third floor. I got off at the same time as him and tried to look confused. It wasn't hard. I kept an eye on which room he was going into and found a quiet corner, hoping nothing would happen. I was wrong. About 10 minutes later, Claire came out of the elevator and headed for the same room. Damn, what was I going to do now? This could easily destroy the people I loved, if she hadn't already. I went downstairs and waited in the hall. I decided to give her one chance and see what she had to say. Like last week, they both got off the elevator together, but this time, before they could separate, I stood in front of them. Claire's face lowered. "Oh, shit." The guy stepped toward me. Claire put her hand on his arm and shook her head. She looked at him and said, "Richard, goodbye. We won't see each other again. Don't mess with me." He stepped back with a confused look. She held out her hand to me, and I saw her eyes fill with tears. She pulled me to a corner of the living room with an alcove. I followed her. The first thing she said struck me to the core. "Dave, this is exactly what it looks like, and I'm going to surrender myself to your mercy. I'm going to answer any questions you have, completely truthfully and honestly. And at the end, if you see fit to tell Brian what you saw and what I'm going to tell you about, it will still be absolutely and unequivocally my fault. No blame will be placed on you." With those words, she picked up the phone and I heard her tell the office that she wasn't coming in this afternoon. She had far more important things to do than work. I was caught off guard. I had no place to start. And Claire noticed this. She waved to the waiter and ordered a Guinness and a white wine. She was very professional and businesslike. I'd never seen her like that before, and why should I? We didn't run in the same work circles. Tears were still in her eyes when she said, "You have until the end of the day. This might take a while." I just nodded. We sat in silence, waiting for our drinks to be brought in. Guinness takes a long time to pour. She sat patiently and quietly, but tears were already running down her cheeks, which she occasionally wiped away with a handkerchief. I sipped from my Guinness. I think I drank half a pint at a time. She waved for the waiter to bring another. Looking at me with sad eyes, she said, "After our conversation at the party, you've probably already guessed what this is about. Do you want me to tell the story? Or do you just want to ask questions?" I didn't understand a damn thing. I put on a confidence I didn't feel and said, "You tell the story, and I'll ask questions as I go along." She wiped away her tears again. Like I said at the party that night, I need more than Brian can give me, and he didn't want to talk about it. I didn't see a way out. Richard just feels like he's filling that hole. Hell, that's not what I meant, filling that need. You might find this hard to believe, many men do, but I can separate the entertainment from the lovemaking. Sometimes I want to be cuddled, made love to, and then I wake up in the arms of a man who loves me. And sometimes I just want good entertainment. Sorry, you're going to get hurt. Brian can't give me a second one yet. He was damn close to it on Saturday. Richard is just doing the second part. I saw no way out but to stay with Brian and get the dose of entertainment I needed. And before you ask, I don't work with him. He was someone I met at a lawyer's meeting across town. He's married and has no plans to leave his wife, and I'm just a side piece for him. We see each other once or twice a month when I have a need, rarely 2 weeks in a row, but he's checked the box, and when Brian gets back on Friday, I'll be able to cuddle in the arms of a man who loves me. That may not sound reasonable to you, but it does to me. Any questions? She was still very businesslike, like she was covering herself with a shield. A few, but I'm trying to figure out how much I really want to know. What questions are important? What answers are important? So some of them are irrelevant because I don't know what is. Like where you and he met and who proposed to whom. It doesn't matter where you met him, but who made the first move. That's easy, he heard me say. I could use some good entertainment. Turned to me and said, I could do it for a hottie, just so my wife doesn't find out. I thought he was joking. Later, he caught me as I was leaving the ladies' restroom, took me by the hand, and led me to one of the partners' offices. I won't go into details, but I got what I asked for. Are you sorry? That's a tough question. Am I sorry you caught me? I don't. Part of me says I'm glad I put it out there. Part of me says I'm glad you gave me a reason to stop, even if Brian leaves me. Part of me regrets that I won't get any more good entertainment. I'll miss it. Regret that I had to leave Brian, yes, absolutely. I don't want to say anything against Brian because it's not his fault. It's all my actions. I should have been stronger. Whether I will continue, I don't know. But probably not, now that Brian is feeling better. Brian and I have started talking, and he took some of my suggestions Sunday night, so I can see a time when Richard won't be needed. Anyway, you forced my hand. Richard will be gone. I don't regret it. She answered several of my questions at once, even the ones I didn't know I wanted answers to, or even intended to ask. I didn't want to know how many times. Once was enough. I wasn't Brian, and that would hurt him, and it would hurt me. And while I cared for her, I didn't love her the way Brian did. Do you love Brian? She didn't answer as I expected. You've seen us together. What do you think? I know the fact that you saw me with Richard makes it questionable, but I'll answer your question. Yes, absolutely. I plan to grow a pair, and the next time he asks me to marry him, I will say yes. You will consider me a conniver and a cheat, and of course you will be right. You will also ask me if I would do it again. I've given it a lot of thought, and if Richard hadn't taken the initiative, no. I was never looking to be entertained. You ask me if he's better than Brian. Yes, of course he's better than Brian in terms of pure entertainment. Otherwise, I wouldn't have done it. That's no excuse, but if Brian and I could just talk about it and he would listen to me, he could be a lot better. Heck, he's a better person just by talking to you for one night. We haven't come to that yet, and I'd still like to know, where is Margaret Thatcher here? You seem to have planned this all out. You answered all my questions as if you knew you were going to get caught. What's more, you answered some that I didn't intend to ask. No, I never expected to get caught. Those are excuses I use to justify it to myself. But honestly, once I leave Richard, I forget about him until I get the itch. By the way, how did you catch us? When we got off the elevator, we could have been anyone, but the look on your face almost killed me, and I wasn't going to lie to you. I told her that Brian was doubting all these increased requests to engage in this, almost as if it was coerced. She looked at it in amazement, and to calm him down, I offered to follow her because I was sure nothing was going on, and I had the receipts from the hotel to prove to Brian that I was here, and I was going to make him pay for my coffee and beer. I told her that I had seen her last Thursday, and while there was nothing inappropriate, when I saw her with this guy, my hair stood up. So I got here earlier in the week, saw Richard checking into his room, followed him in, and saw her walk into the same room. Shit, she said. It wasn't a guilty pleasure. I was just trying to make him better. I was just trying to make him into the lover I know he can be. He's good at everything else. He just needs a little help with that. Oh shit. I had a lot to think about. I have a couple questions. Why didn't you ask me not to tell Brian? That seemed to throw her off balance. I wouldn't have done that to you. It wouldn't have been fair to either of you. I wouldn't ask you to choose between me and him. I know what you two have done in the past and how much you cared for each other. I wouldn't ask you to put me above him. I know you like me, but not that much. I'm sorry. I like you and you're a good friend. So I couldn't do that to you either. Before you tell Brian, can I ask you a favor? One last one, because he's definitely going to dump me, kick me out. And I don't think you're going to be my friend for long. She reached across the table to take my hand. I yanked it away like I'd been bitten and didn't let her touch me. I guess I deserved it. Tears stood in her eyes. Let me tell him, please. I'll be honest with him, right down to the fact that you caught us, and I asked you to let me be the bearer of bad news. I can't let his best friend tell him when I'm breaking his heart myself. I looked at her and stood up. I want to scream and yell at you and call you every name under this goddamn sun. I need to think, if I make a mistake, I'm going to ruin a whole bunch of friendships, mine and Brian's, yours and Brian's, mine and yours, and a whole bunch more. I paused. Until an hour ago, I treasured our friendship. With those words, I left, leaving even a near pint of Guinness on the table, more important than a good beer or even a Guinness. Damn, blast and damn again. What the hell to do now? The first task is to protect Brian. But how and from what? From his inadequacy, her cheating, his goddamn heartache? I didn't sleep that night, but I didn't drink too much beer either. Solutions didn't come through the alcoholic haze, but by morning, I had a plan. I knew Brian wouldn't be home until 5 o'clock that evening, but I know how these courses can go, especially on a Friday. I don't think he'll be home closer to an hour than 5, and I don't want to be caught having a deep conversation with his girlfriend. I sent Claire a message saying, go shopping in Waitrose at 10 o'clock. I'll bump into you, we'll have a coffee, and I'll give you some options. Delete this message now. I got to the supermarket, grabbed a basket and started wandering around, stuffing stuff into it. I don't use wet wipes. I wash my hands with soap and water. So what the hell were they doing in my basket? I knew what a bottle of gin was doing in there. We bumped into each other right at the entrance to the cafe. We went inside, she sat down, and I grabbed 2 coffees. As I handed her mine, I got my first good look at her face. I had seen my face in the mirror and looked rough and knew how I felt, but she looked much worse and must have felt it too. This time, my balls grew, and I started. Looking her straight in the eye, in a voice I didn't quite recognize as my own, I began. Part of me hates you, and part of me loves you like a sister. I didn't sleep last night. As a man, I understand what you're getting at if you want to share the fun and the love, because I did. Katie was a prime example. And as much as I want to hate you for it, I can't. I can't be such a hypocrite. I figured if someone told him, it was okay to do as you said. But I have an alternative. Confusion flashed in her eyes. There was only one way this could end for her. We'll never tell him what you did. I reasoned so she didn't have coffee in her mouth or a cup in her hand. I'd never seen anyone look so surprised. When I sat down at the table with the coffee, I think she saw the Grim Reaper sitting on my shoulder. What? How? When? How? What? It's my suggestion. We'll never tell him. There are a few things you said. He gets better. He starts talking. He listens to you. While he was gone, he Googled something on the internet, and it led him to a whole bunch of women's magazines. He says women are weird, and he's probably not wrong. But that's why he was more inclined to listen to you this week. You told me what you should have told him. He told me what he should have told you. You two need to talk together. I know you've been trying and he's been fighting you off. But from what I understand from your conversations, it started happening last weekend. So if you promise me on your mother's grave, and I know she's not dead yet, that you will never cheat on him and will love him until the day one of you leaves this earth, I won't tell him and will leave it up to you. I will still listen and help you both, because I love you both. The look on her face was as if the Grim Reaper sitting on my shoulder had just fallen off his perch. You'd do that for me? For Brian and me? Yes, I'll do it for my two dearest friends, all their parents, and quite selfishly for me too. But if you let him down one more time, I'll spread those sordid details far and wide. She was already openly crying and running out of paper napkins. I even handed her my handkerchief, having bought a clean one and a spare. She'd cried a lot the last few times we'd met. Yeah, hell yeah, anything, absolutely anything, she said. Right now, some harsh realities, and hopefully this will help more. I didn't bother telling her about Sharon Pontic White. I hinted that I was rinsing down there and the taste of soap made him think of blowing bubbles. I didn't pursue the subject further. I suppressed the embarrassment in me and told her how I had treated Katie, and I told Brian the same thing. I tried to help her so she could help him. She sat there with a stunned expression on her face, and I don't know what surprised her more, what I had done, or the fact that I dared to tell her what I had done to Katie. I got up. I needed to leave urgently and told her. I'm completely exhausted. You've worn me out. I'm playing rugby tomorrow afternoon. Maybe I'll see you there. Maybe I won't. If you're not there tomorrow as a couple, well, I'll see you then. I walked out. I paid for the gin but left the napkins. That was it. The deed was done. Time to move on. At least Brian would still be around. Of that I was sure. We pulled ourselves up, slapping each other on the back, yelling at each other, calling each other names as we ran out of the pavilion. Right at the foot of the steps stood Brian and Claire, the biggest smile on her face. And he was just as happy as Larry. He gave me 2 thumbs up. He was laughing heartily. I don't remember much about the game. They told me I ran like the wind and we won the game. I didn't see them that weekend or the next. They were gone for a few days. The following Wednesday, I got a call from Claire asking if I would be at the club on Friday night. It sounded like she was asking me to be there, and I told her I would. There was a small disco going on, not very loud music, more like background noise. The 3 of us sat in an alcove. Claire had a serious look on her face, and I noticed she hadn't had much to drink. She sat between us, and suddenly, as the music faded, she turned to Brian. I felt her hand touch my thigh, which was a little strange, but then she found my hand and squeezed it. Looking Brian straight in the face, she said, "Are you going to ask me?" "Ask you what?" "You know, the question you've been puzzling over for the last 6 months." Oh shit. Oh, does that mean you're ready? Stupid fool, I thought to myself. Maybe it was the beer. Well, you won't know until you ask. Surprisingly, he did it right. Shuffling over to the edge of the pew, he got down on one knee and said, "Claire Wolstenholme, will you do me the great honor of becoming my wife?" Everyone noticed Brian kneeling, and there was silence in the hall. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes," she said. Squeezing my hand lightly, she released it, slid over to him, and buried her face in his. 6 months later, they were married. And yes, I did hit it off with one of the bridesmaids, but not the main one. She was married. It was Harriet, and she and I dated for the next 18 months. I took Harriet very seriously, and she moved in with me for a while. 18 months after they were married, young Daniel came along and I was his godfather. That's when Harriet left me. When the christening had subsided and only a few of our close friends remained, I got down on one knee and asked Harriet to marry me. She didn't hold back but stood up, said no, and walked out the door. Everyone was stunned. My two best friends hugged me while I cried. When I got home, Harriet had already moved out. A couple weeks later, we met for a cup of coffee, and she explained that she couldn't share me, couldn't share her love. I had no idea what she meant. 14 months later, Daniel was joined by Kirsty, and once again, I was the godfather. I went to this christening alone. Things went my way. Over the years, I'd had several girlfriends. None lasted longer than a couple of years, and I resigned myself to leaving this world a bachelor. I was rarely alone. My two best friends made sure of that. Daniel went into the army. I was at his parade at Sandhurst and at Kirsty's graduation from university. Both kids had difficulties along the way, but they turned out to be good people. I was getting on. At 53, you're too old to play rugby, your bones don't heal as well, and I wasn't as fast as I used to be. Brian called me and asked me to meet them on Monday at a pub on the other side of town. We hadn't met at that pub on Monday since the day he told me he thought Claire was cheating on him. That alarmed me a little, but I was even more alarmed when we got there. He was sitting in the same alcove we'd sat in all those years ago, and he looked rough, very rough. I saw him last week, and he looked rough, but not as bad as he looked now. There was a kind of sadness about him. I started, "You look a bit shit, mate. Is everything all right?" Actually, no. Everything is pretty screwed up. Remember when we set the dumpster on fire after smoking our first and last cigarette, and we had to do a lung cancer study? It's not lung cancer, but it's cancer, leukemia. I reached out and grabbed him, and my world came crashing down. I opened my mouth to say something, but he held up his hand and I stopped. "Sorry, buddy. This is bad. I just discovered this disease and it's untreatable. I've got a month. No more. I'm never going back to that goddamn pub again." And that's when I noticed Claire standing on the other side of me. She pulled herself close to me, and the three of us cried our eyes out. "Isn't there anything they can do?" Claire replied. "No, it's gone too far. We didn't know he had it. He just felt tired, so we went to bed early. When he woke up last week looking like that, I made him go to the doctor. He refused. He said it was work and he was just tired." I won't describe the next 3 weeks. They were pretty shitty. The week before Brian died, I was at the hospital visiting him. He gave me an envelope and told me to open it when he left. He made me promise not to open it until then. I promised. The funeral was crowded and we went to a club. Daniel was married and had children, as did Kirsty, and we tried to make it a joyous occasion, a celebration of life, but it was hard work. As we entered the club, Claire asked me if I had the envelope. Yes, it was in the inside pocket of my jacket. I just tapped it, and she smiled at me. I forgot about it until I got home, and then I wasn't in the mood and left it in my jacket. I didn't know how my relationship with Claire would play out. We met for a cup of coffee during the week. She was holding up well, perhaps even better than I was. About a month after the funeral, she called me to see if I could go over to their house and help Daniel. They wanted to move some beds. I arrived, as requested, on Saturday afternoon. Daniel needed help to remove an old bed from his bedroom because he was taking it to his house. Then to take the double bed from Brian and Claire's room and put it in his old room. Claire had a new bed. I couldn't always understand the logic with which Claire approached the situation. But what she wanted, she got. The new bed arrived just as we finished moving the others, and Danelle and I assembled it. After the sweaty work, we were sitting in the kitchen drinking cold old speckle hens when Daniel said to me, "Uncle David." He hadn't called me uncle since he left for the army. This was getting weird. "You haven't read the letter yet, have you?" "No. Knowing your father, he'll just thank me for everything I've done, which isn't really necessary. And when I do, it will seem to me like he's really gone. The whole time I leave the letter unopened, as if part of it is still here." I thought about it for a bit and said to Daniel, "That's not the point. Do you know what's in there?" "I don't know, but I'm guessing. I think Mom wants you to open it." I promised him I would read it as soon as I got home. We drank a few more beers and I headed home. As I had a few beers, Claire asked me to let her know when I was coming over in case I wandered into the woods or something. I sent her a text. "This isn't going to be easy. I poured myself a large glass of gin and tonic, which was a lot of gin and not much tonic. I opened the letter and began to read it. It was handwritten and had a few crossouts in it. Buddy, you think that with this letter, I am thanking you for being my best friend for over 50 years. And it will make you cry? It will be a trip down memory lanes. Sally kisses Charlie and also throws up in the trash can we just lit with our first and last cigarette. We both got pinks for it, but didn't tell our parents because they'd give us another spanking. Collecting pocket money to pay for the glass of the greenhouse we broke with a cricket ball. Actually had to throw a tennis ball. My old banger, 20 miles per gallon, because the other 20 miles per gallon was leaking out of a broken pipe and we were stuck overnight in Skegness. God, it was so cold to sleep in the car. There were several girlfriends until we met Claire. That's when I realized she was the one for me. Yeah, that month when I thought she was cheating on me was hard. She was different from everyone else. I cared, really cared, but I was doing it all wrong. I was a bit macho, thinking I knew everything about how to give a woman pleasure. But I didn't, and you, as always, stepped in and helped me, by the way. I found a phrase that really slowed me down. Try memorizing it, let alone uttering it when you're 2 steps away from dropping your load. Not that you need it, but it works. The Honorable Margaret Thatcher, leader of the Conservative Party, Prime Minister of Her Royal Highness Elizabeth II of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland and Queen, head of the Commonwealth, defender of the faith. How bloody difficult it was, but it worked. And I know the help you gave Claire in those couple weeks before she accepted my offer. Your decision was the right one. I didn't think so when she told me, but we talked about it, and I'm grateful. Because that decision must have caused you a lot of pain. Calm down, buddy. It was the right one. Because of you, I have lived a wonderful life. I have lived and loved a wonderful woman, and she has given me 2 beautiful children and many grandchildren. Without your clear thinking that day, it would never have happened. Thanks, buddy. Now for the kids. The time you spent talking to Daniel while he was at Sandhurst and struggling. The time you ran miles and miles with him without saying anything. When he came back from Iraq, he told me how you hugged him and he poured his heart out to you when he lost that guy in his platoon. He wanted to show me he could handle it, to make me proud of him. I was glad you encouraged him to come to me. Crying with my son after what he'd been through was very humbling. You were there for Kirsty when she fell into bad company. She did things her mother and I wouldn't have approved of. She told me how you yelled at her, made her feel so small, told her she was better. We never talked about that little trip to her university with baseball bats. I remember looking at the flames of the fire we made out of clothes and baseball bats, and you holding me. And thank you for being there for me, and not letting that jerk blind me. This is Claire's first account of that little escapade. I hope we helped you, especially when Harriet dumped you, we saw how much it hurt. But when she did, and how she did it, and what she said to you, it made us think. And we looked at things differently. Claire and I think that's the reason you're lonely too. This is the hardest thing for you, not me, because A, I'm not here anymore. B, Claire and I realized this a long time ago. In fact, you're probably the only one who doesn't see it. You love Claire. Because you love me as a mate, you've pushed it away. You've buried it. Harriet saw it, and so did many other girls. That's why they didn't stay. They loved you, but they couldn't share you. This may come as a surprise to you, but she always really liked you. But after your decision not to tell me what happened while I was away, that liked turned into loved. It started out as brotherly love. But after everything you did for us, it grew. It didn't bother me because I knew she loved me more than she loved you. And anyway, I love you too. So now I'd like to ask you for a couple more favors. 1. Look after my wife as much as you can. She is very, very dear to me, and I know you will do a brilliant job at it. 2. Do not marry her for 1 year and 1 day after my funeral. It's not for me. I'm not here. I'm only in your heart. But my parents might not take it very well. Oh, I think Danny and Kirsty would be over the moon if you asked her. One more thing. She's a warm, wonderful woman, so please don't wait a year and a day to cement your love. You have my full blessing. Okay, buddy. That's it for now. I'm tired. And by the way, Claire is sitting next to me as I write this. She helps me when I'm having a hard time writing. So, buddy, I will ask you to continue to take care of my family as you have done for the last 30 plus years. Goodbye, and thank you from the bottom of my heart. Your best friend in the world, Brian. The letter was soaked in my tears. I couldn't think. I finished my gin and tonic and almost choked. Suddenly, I felt a hand on my shoulder and almost jumped out of my skin. I turned around and there was Claire. She was crying. I really should have locked the damn back door, but it didn't matter, though. She had a key to my house anyway. Brian and I were right. Do you love me? I don't know. Had I been hiding it all this time to protect Brian? I really don't know. I pulled her back at arm's length and she tilted her head slightly to one side and smiled, her face lighting up. I think you're still trying to hide it, she said. Let me make it easy for you. Since that day at Waitrose, I've fallen more and more in love with you, and it's grown into love. Don't get me wrong, I love Brian a lot more, but who could not love a man for all that you've done for us? I didn't mind being second best. She took my hand and led me towards the stairs, looking at me and saying, I think it's time. It was a weird party between Christmas and New Year's Eve, and almost everyone was there. My parents, Brian and Claire's parents, Daniel and Kirsty and their tribes. It was like people were walking on the edge. My three dads caught me in a corner. They were kind of corralling me. Brian's father, Jonathan, looked me straight in the eye and said, When are you going to ask her? About what? Claire to marry you, of course. Who said that? Then Claire's father spoke his word. Well, it's obvious to everyone but you. Daniel and Kirsty can't wait. You've been part of their family for so long that this will be the final stage. You're not replacing their dad, you're an added bonus. It's almost like they have two dads. I gave in. Jonathan, Brian wrote me a letter before he died. He told me things I didn't know about myself. And yes, I will ask her. But he asked me to wait a year and a day because he didn't want to upset you. He wasn't sure how you would take it. It was my father's turn. We watched you grow up and saw the messes you both got into. And if some of the rumors are true, you've done some things recently. Jonathan continued. Listen, son, we have your full blessing. Don't wait. Don't waste any time. And we're not getting any younger. They let me go. I went back into the living room and there was silence. I looked around the room. Everyone was looking at me. It was a bloody setup. Brian's mother was fiddling with her fingers. She walked over to me and put something in my hand. I looked down. It was a wedding ring. I'll only lend it to you until you buy yourself a normal one. I was about to walk over to Claire when suddenly she was beside me. I got down on one knee and mouthed the words. She held out her hand to me, and as I slipped the ring on her finger, the room erupted in joyous screams. Not very romantic. I kissed her and whispered in her ear. This is all a setup. How much of this did you know? All of it. Who do you think set it up? I love you. We were married 6 weeks later. I told Daniel and Kirsty to never call me daddy, never call me uncle. They never called me daddy, but to annoy me, they sometimes called me uncle with a smile on their face. After all these years, I realized that yes, I did love her. But strangely enough, it was from that day when she was brutally frank with me in the hotel lobby. Her willingness to look at things dispassionately, yet take absolutely all the blame and try to protect Brian and I and our relationship as buddies. The end. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. So subscribe to my channel and watch the next video. They were just finishing dinner when the doorbell rang. 12-year-old Lori jumped up to answer the door before her father or brother could get up, but quickly returned to the dining room with a bewildered expression on her face. It's a policeman, Daddy. He wants to talk to you, she informed him. Frank was struck with fear, but he did his best to hide it from his children. When he got to the door, he saw that the caller was actually a Georgia State Trooper. Are you Frank Parker? The policeman asked. Yes, Frank confirmed. Are you Meredith Parker's husband? When Frank nodded, the policeman looked at the two children and said, May I speak to you in private, Mr. Parker? Frank felt his throat constrict and had to clear it before he could speak. Bobby, Lori, please go to your rooms. I need to talk to the officer alone. Both children started to protest, but when their father barked at them, "Now!" they jumped up and hurried to obey. They were not used to hearing such a tone of voice. Once the children had left the room, the officer turned to their father again. Mr. Parker, I've been asked to give you some bad news. Your wife's airplane is missing and presumed shot down. It disappeared from radar tonight about halfway between Miami International Airport and Nassau. A Coast Guard ship is now in the area looking for survivors. The facts were simple enough. Serving as vice president of regional sales for a large multinational corporation, Meredith traveled with the region's CFO to visit their Caribbean headquarters in the Bahamas. She was an experienced small airplane pilot, so a 180-mile flight to Nassau should have been routine. Frank hadn't given it much thought when Meredith had called and informed him of her plans. Now he was distraught. It was his worst nightmare. His wife's plane had crashed overnight in the shark-infested waters of the Caribbean. The officer gave a few additional details that were not at all reassuring to Frank, and promised that the Coast Guard would call in the morning or sooner if there was any news. No sooner had the door closed behind the policeman than Bobby and Lori came running up to him with concern on their faces, asking questions their father couldn't answer. Frank knew they were eavesdropping. He'd be eavesdropping too if he were in their shoes. The three of them huddled together, each trying to find encouraging words to say to the other. Lori began to cry, and though he tried to be brave, Bobby's eyes turned red as well. Frank was trying his best to hold himself together for the sake of his children, but inside he was beyond furious. Doing the dishes or homework was out of the question. They spent the rest of the evening at arm's length from each other. It was past the time when the children usually went to bed, but there was still no phone call. Finally, exhausted by the late hour and their fears, all three of them moved into the bedroom, and the children fell asleep with their father for the first time since they were small and afraid of thunderstorms. The next morning, they were already up and trying to eat breakfast when a Coast Guard representative called. The faint hope generated by the call was quickly extinguished when the officer informed Frank that the boat combing the area had found nothing. Frank called the principal of the middle school the children attended and told her why Bobby and Lori would be absent that day. He then went to check on them, but found them sitting in front of the television watching a CNN report on the missing airplane. Frank wasn't sure if he should let them watch further or turn off the TV, but no sooner had he made up his mind than the phone rang again. And from then on, as soon as Frank hung up after one call, another one came in. Not surprisingly, Meredith's parents and his own were the first to call. All of them were beyond worried, but they were also trying to exude false optimism that she would miraculously be found. Frank promised to call back immediately with any news. Then followed calls from Meredith's friends and co-workers. Everyone wanted to say or do something to help, but none of them had any idea how to do it. The conversations were short and awkward. The most difficult of all were the calls from members of the media. He should have expected them, but Frank was caught off guard when the first reporter called, and he talked to the Journal-Constitution reporter much longer than he wanted to. Then other media started calling, and when Frank realized what was going on, he started screening out all the calls and answering only those from people he cared about. During all this activity, a procession of neighbors and friends began, each coming to their doors with condolences and food. At first, their generosity was appreciated, as Frank did not have the energy to cook, but soon he and his children had more food than they could hope to eat in a week. It was an old Southern tradition to express concern and condolences with food, but while Frank appreciated the gesture, every roast and casserole was a bitter reminder that his wife, with whom he had lived for 20 years, was almost certainly dead. The next few days were horrible. The Parkers were virtually prisoners in their own home, held together by a desire not to deal with other people and the hope of some news from the Coast Guard. Frank called the Miami office daily for the latest news, but the reports were always negative. And 5 days after a state trooper showed up on their doorstep, the news they had been dreading came. A Coast Guard officer called to inform Frank that the wreckage of his wife's plane had been found. There was no sign of survivors. "I'm sorry, sir," the officer concluded, "but at this time we have to cease search and rescue efforts." Frank wanted only one thing, to hide and mourn alone. But there was no such opportunity. Instead, he was faced with an endless list of responsibilities, all of them excruciating. The worst part, of course, was breaking the sad news to Bobby and Lori and trying to comfort them. When they finally calmed down, he had to call family and close friends to let them know. Then he called their church to organize a memorial service, then the newspaper to write an obituary. More calls followed to let them know the time and date of the service. By the time he finished the job, Frank felt physically and emotionally exhausted. Somehow, the family made it through the service and began the slow, painful process of trying to get back to normal life. The children returned to school the following week, and resuming a familiar lifestyle seemed to help a little. Frank was less fortunate. He now had a whole new set of responsibilities. At the urging of a friend, Frank contacted a lawyer to find out what his legal responsibilities were. He was shocked to learn that he would have to apply for a death certificate. "But her plane crashed at sea," he protested. "How can there be any doubt?" "I know," the lawyer lamented, "but in the absence of a body and a doctor's note, the court must make an official statement." "Do I really have to wait 7 years?" asked Frank in frustration. "No," his lawyer assured him. "In cases like this one, where a person has gone missing at sea, there are usually no significant delays. After the attack on the World Trade Center, death certificates were issued within days, although some bodies were never identified. You may have to answer some questions, but these cases are usually resolved very quickly." "I can draft a petition for you," the attorney continued. "I can also help you amend all the other documents." When Frank looked confused, the lawyer said, "Well, you know, like joint bank accounts, mortgages, insurance, car titles, wills, anything. While I'm at it, you need to contact your wife's company and find out what benefits you're entitled to and get all your personal belongings." Frank shook his head tiredly. In his grief, he couldn't stop thinking about how difficult it would be to unravel the life he and his wife had shared. Now he had one more thing to do that he dreaded: to call the widow of John Collier, the CFO who was on the plane with Meredith. Frank had only met Collier a couple of times at his wife's company events, but he immediately disliked the executive. In Frank's opinion, Collier was one of those narcissistic types who think they are smarter than everyone else. In the short time Frank spent with him, Collier had managed to list enough names and brag about his accomplishments to leave a bad taste in Frank's mouth. But it was not his widow's fault, Frank reminded himself, and he felt it his duty to address her. Frank called ahead, and Amanda Collier was already waiting for him. As they exchanged condolences, Frank realized that she was probably the only one who truly understood how he felt. As they settled down in her parlor, she asked affectionately, "How are you now, Frank?" "It's hard, Amanda, really hard. I just can't accept that she's really gone. So many things remind me of her." He shook his head helplessly. "You know what the hardest part is? When I'm on the street or in a crowd of people, I keep thinking I've spotted her. The other day, I must have scared some poor woman half to death when I caught up with her because I thought it was Meredith." He looked at the floor, recalling the memories and his emotions when he realized what he was doing. Amanda looked at him sympathetically. She knew that no words would help. Finally, he looked up at her. "And you, Amanda, how are you doing?" "It's not easy, Frank, but I can handle it," she told him. "The truth is, I'm probably coping a lot better than you are. John and I didn't have children, so I don't have two to comfort them the way you do. Besides, and I wouldn't tell this to anyone else, John and I didn't really get along before all this happened. I've caught him having a couple affairs in the past, and I think he was in the middle of another affair. If that hadn't happened, we'd probably be headed for divorce a long time ago." "I'm sorry to hear that, Amanda," Frank told her sympathetically. "I can only imagine the conflicting emotions you are feeling." "Yes," she agreed. "One moment I'm relieved that I don't have to deal with his cheating anymore, and the next I feel guilty because I don't feel any sadder. And no matter what, some part of me still misses him." "Are you going to be okay financially?" asked Frank, trying to change the subject. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "The good news is that the company insured Frank's life, and since he died while on a business trip, under the double indemnity clause, I'll get twice the face value. The bad news is that I'm going to need every penny of that money because I learned that Frank made a series of bad investments in the futures market and severely depleted our assets." What Amanda had said about her late husband didn't surprise Frank. He could not believe that a selfish man like John Collier would not be a faithful husband. Besides, the idea that Collier fancied himself a market trader was entirely consistent with Frank's idea of the man. Frank's attention was drawn to Amanda's mention of company-paid life insurance. He remembered his lawyer's advice and made a mental note to contact Meredith's benefits department immediately. If Collier was insured, Meredith must have life insurance, and until he found a job, the funds might come in handy. After chatting for a few more minutes, Frank rose from the couch. Amanda, please forgive me, but I have to cut my visit short. Billy and Lori will be getting out of school soon, and I need to pick them both up. But please stay in touch, and if there's anything I can do to help, even if you just need to duck a sympathetic ear, please don't hesitate to call me. When Frank pulled up to their house after picking up Bobby and Lori, he was surprised to see a car parked out front. Frank led the children into the house through the garage, and a minute later, the doorbell rang. Outside stood a man in his 50s and a young woman dressed in business clothes. I'm Special Agent Harold Barnes, the man introduced himself, and this is Special Agent Celia Murray. We're with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. We'd like to stop by and ask you a few questions in connection with your wife's disappearance. Realizing that the two men were law enforcement officers, Lori wrapped her arms around her father's waist and buried her face in his side. Frank felt her tears wet his shirt and held her tightly against him. What does that mean? He demanded angrily. Before the first agent could speak, Agent Murray intervened. I'm very sorry we've upset your daughter, Mr. Parker. All we are trying to do is complete a routine check in connection with your application for Mrs. Parker's death certificate. If you would like us to come back later, we will try to do so at your convenience. Frank ignored her and turned to face his daughter. It's okay, sweetheart. Nothing bad happened. The female agent dropped dramatically to one knee, reached into her purse, pulled out a napkin, and held it out to the girl. Here, honey, she said in a gentle voice. Lori hesitated and timidly accepted the napkin, wiped her eyes, and then blew her nose. When Frank saw that his daughter had calmed down, he put his arm around her and spoke to her. These people need to talk to me a little bit about your mom, Lori. Why don't you go and start doing your homework? I'll be here in the living room if you need me. With those words, he gave the 12-year-old girl a gentle nudge toward her room. He then turned to face the officers. If it doesn't take too long, let's try to get it over with. The three of them walked into the living room and settled around the coffee table. We need to get a little information about your wife, Mr. Parker, the male agent began. How long were you married? We got married in 1990, right after graduating from the University of Georgia, Frank replied, remembering the beautiful brunette he had won over so many years earlier. And she worked for the International Marketing Corporation until, well, before she disappeared? That's right, Frank confirmed. She was vice president of sales for the southeastern United States. If her region is the southeast, why would she go to the Bahamas? A younger woman asked. At IMC, Frank explains, the southeast included Puerto Rico and the Caribbean, as well as the United States. Their Caribbean headquarters was in Nassau, so Mary often had to fly there. Mary? The woman asked. Frank felt his voice grow hoarse. Mary was my pet name for her. Agent Murray reached out and patted him sympathetically on the shoulder. It's all right, Mr. Parker. I know this is hard on you. The senior agent decided to change the line of questioning. Was it normal for your wife to fly her own plane on business trips? Yes, Frank replied. Mary's father was a pilot, and she got her license as soon as she was old enough. She took every opportunity to fly herself because, she said, it made her independent of commercial airline schedules. She said she could get where she needed to go, complete her business, and return home while her competitors were still stuck in the terminal. She felt it gave her an advantage, especially when she was just starting out. Both agents took notes, then Agent Murray looked up at him. What about you, Mr. Parker? What do you do? Frank managed to smile. I'm a house husband. Noticing their looks, he continued. I was an aerospace engineer until 3 years ago when my company downsized and I was laid off. The only chance of finding a new job would have required me to move out of state. But in the meantime, Mary's job was going great. She had gotten several big promotions and was making an excellent salary, plus big bonuses. It didn't make sense for her to quit, so we agreed that I would run the household and take care of the kids while she worked. And how has this change affected your relationship with Mrs. Parker? Agent Barnes asked. What's that got to do with it? Asked Frank irritably. Please bear with us, Mr. Parker, the younger woman intervened. We need to see if any factors played a role in your wife's disappearance. This is routine procedure. Calming down a bit, Frank looked at them both. Sure, it was a big change for me, but I'm an engineer. I'm trained to measure and evaluate all factors in a design. It was easy to realize that my change in role was the right thing for our family at that moment. I let Mary devote himself to his career and made sure Bobby and Lori were always close to their parents. Neither agent said anything, and it seemed to Frank that the question hung in the air like that. I don't mean to say it was easy, he continued. She was always calling clients or attending meetings at the corporation, so I didn't see her as often as I would have liked. Sometimes I felt like her work came first, and... He suddenly realized what he was saying and added hastily. But that's quite common in corporate life. Besides, things have been going well. He caught himself that things had been going well so far. 2 more questions, Mr. Parker, Agent Barnes said. Did you notice any changes in your wife's behavior in the time leading up to her disappearance? Not really, Frank replied after a moment's thought. I know she's been under a lot of pressure the last year or so, and her travel schedule has been busier than ever. But Mary said she was in line for a serious promotion. When she got it, she promised that the new job would cut down on her travel and come with a high-ranking position and a big pay increase. One last question, Agent Barnes said, jotting down notes in his notebook. Are you aware of any changes in your finances that your wife may have made in the last few months? No, Frank answered confidently. I keep an eye on all our finances and haven't seen anything out of the ordinary. The young woman glanced at her partner. I think we've taken up enough of your time, Mr. Parker. We'll be able to wrap this up pretty quickly, and we'll let you know as soon as we're done. In the meantime, if you think of anything you think we should know, give me a call at this number. Having said that, she handed him her business card, and the 2 agents headed for the door. Frank went back to his children's bedrooms to make sure they had done their homework. When he peeked into their rooms, both looked busy. They're strong kids, he thought. They've been through hell and are holding up well no matter what. The next day, Frank drove to IMC headquarters to visit the benefits department. The head of the department met him, and after expressing her condolences, handed him a box of Meredith's personal belongings from her office. Frank had to swallow when he saw the framed family portrait she kept on her desk. The director then referred him to a specialist to advise him on Meredith's benefits. The first thing he did was examine Meredith's 401k account. Frank had read her annual reports regularly, so he didn't expect any surprises. However, when he saw the total, it was much higher than he had expected. Apparently, Meredith had increased her contributions to her retirement fund over the past year, even more than she was entitled to from the company. She was really trying to provide for her family, the specialist commented admiringly. The specialist further advised Frank to withdraw the funds as soon as possible and roll them into his own IRA to make it easier for him to manage the funds. Another surprise to Frank was the sheet he received describing the insurance benefit he would receive as Meredith's beneficiary. He learned that Meredith had chosen the maximum amount of insurance to which she was entitled. With the accidental death factor factored in, Frank realized with amazement that he would receive Meredith's income for almost 4 years. The insurance company will pay that amount in annual installments, the woman explained. Otherwise, the taxes will eat you alive. Payment of all benefits was, of course, contingent on the company receiving a copy of Meredith's death certificate. But after a visit from 2 GBI agents, Frank was confident that would happen soon. Frank left the office building with great relief. He had thought he would have to start looking for another job immediately. Now he realized that he had a significant reprieve to get his life together. Thank you, Mary, he whispered fervently. A few days later, Frank was preparing dinner for his family late one evening when the doorbell rang. When Frank went to answer it, he found Special Agent Murray on the doorstep. After he invited her in, she explained the purpose of her visit. Mr. Parker, Frank, I wanted to personally inform you that our investigation is complete and that your wife's death certificate has been issued. You should receive a copy from the court in the mail in the next few days. Frank breathed a sigh of relief. He had believed there would be no problems, but it was good to know that this important task had been accomplished. At that moment, a panicked cry came from the back of the house, and Frank was startled to hear Laurie's voice. "Daddy, help me! Help me!" He turned and rushed to Laurie's room. Celia Murray followed at his heels, her hand reaching for the service revolver in the shoulder holster under her jacket. When Frank burst into Laurie's room, he saw his daughter staring at a large red bloodstain on her jeans. "I'm bleeding, Daddy," she wailed. Frank was horrified. "What happened, Laurie? Did you cut yourself?" As he headed toward his daughter, someone's hand grabbed his elbow and pulled him back with sudden force. "Let me handle this," Celia said firmly and pushed him toward the door. "But he protested, but the young woman didn't back down. "I'll handle this, Frank. Just go out into the living room and wait." Something commanding in her voice made him pause, and when the determined young woman blocked his path, he hesitantly retreated into the hallway. Celia calmly closed the door in his face. After 15 anxious minutes, the door opened, and Celia appeared on the threshold. Before Frank could ask a question, she grabbed his arm. "Laurie's fine. You need to go to the store right now and buy a pack of sanitary napkins. Get the smallest size." "But Laurie, Bobby," he began to protest. "I'll take care of Laurie and let Bobby know what's going on. You, on the other hand, need to go to the store and get back here as soon as possible," she said. As Frank drove to the nearest store, it hit him, and he began to berate himself. "She's menstruating, you idiot. You should have realized it right away." On the way back, he kept cursing himself for never having talked to his daughter about growing up and becoming a woman. "Oh, Mary, I need you more than ever," he thought in self-pity. When he got home, Celia met him at the front door and snatched the package from him. Looking at the package, she smiled. "You did good, Daddy." Then she disappeared into Laurie's room. After another 30 minutes, Celia reappeared, hugging Laurie, who somewhat shyly slumped back. Frank dropped to his knees and hugged his daughter as she walked over to him. "Oh, honey, I'm so sorry. I should have talked to you about this a long time ago. I just didn't think about it." "It's all right, Daddy," the girl spoke. "I just didn't realize what was going on and I got scared." Celia explained it all to me. "Now I know what to do." As she spoke, she took Celia's hand, and Frank realized that his daughter had made a new friend. He stood up and turned to Celia. "Thank you very much." "It's good you were here. I must have panicked for a moment." He looked at his daughter. "I'm afraid I'm not very good with girls." Celia smiled, but no sooner had she spoken than Bobby popped up from around the corner. "Just because my stupid little sister has first period, does that mean we won't have dinner tonight?" "I'm starving." "Bobby!" Laurie shrieked, but Frank grabbed her before she could pounce on her older brother. "Bobby, if you talk to your sister like that again, I guarantee you'll go to bed hungry," warned Frank to his son. But before his threat sounded too ominous, he continued. "Now go wash your hands and set the table." Then he turned to Celia again. "The least we can do is offer you a meal for all you've done. It's not exactly fine dining, but there is something to eat." The young woman was clearly embarrassed. "Thank you, but I can't interfere." Her protests were cut short, however, when Laurie tugged on her arm. "Please, Celia, stay and eat with us." Looking at her new friend, Celia smiled and said, "Okay, Laurie, just for you." Looking at Frank, she smiled again. "Thank you. I would love to have dinner with your family." The four of them sat down at the table, and Celia was the subject of many questions from the two children about her experiences in law enforcement. Frank ate and listened, both amused by his children's curiosity and delighted at how easily Celia handled their questions. He suddenly realized that for the first time in a while, the two of them seemed to be coming out of a sorrowful shell. When dessert was finished, Frank sent Bobby and Laurie off to do chores and then offered Celia a cup of coffee. As they sat at the table, Frank had a chance to ask his questions. "You seem to be comfortable with Bobby and Laurie. Do you work with young people often?" She smiled. "I actually come from a big family, 2 brothers and 3 sisters. I was the oldest, so I guess I was a second mom to the others." She paused to take a sip of coffee, then continued. "That's why I knew what to do with Laurie this afternoon. I walked each of my sisters through the trauma of puberty." She looked at Frank and smiled again. For that matter, my dad was as helpless as you are today. Frank grinned mischievously. Well, all I can say is that I'm glad you ended up here. Even when I finally realized what was going on, I still wouldn't have known how to calm Lori down so quickly. She smiled in gratitude, but then her expression became more serious. How are they coping with the loss of their mother? She asked. Frank sighed. I guess that's about as well as could be expected. Lori was very clingy. I think she's sorely lacking in female influence. As for Bobby, it's hard to say. He's gotten moody and a little withdrawn, but I don't know if that's a result of Mary's death or just the fact that he's a teenager now. Celia looked at him sympathetically. From what I've seen, I think you're doing a great job with them. It's just going to take time, both for them and for you. With those words, she stood up and said, I really enjoyed the meal, Frank, but I've been intruding on your family for too long. I have to go now, but if you don't mind, I'd like to say goodbye to Lori and Bobby. When Frank nodded, she walked out into the hallway, and Frank heard her say goodbye to Bobby. She then spent a few minutes in Lori's room, and when she returned, Lori was walking with her arm around Celia's waist. She really has a new friend, Frank thought in surprise. A few days later, a package arrived in the mail for Lori. When his excited daughter opened the package, she found a pink stuffed elephant along with a note from Celia. Frank was delighted by this concern, but was puzzled by the choice. Lori's too old for stuffed animals, he thought, but was surprised to see the toy take a prominent place on Lori's bed. I guess she still has a little girl in her, he admitted. The next day, he called Celia's office to thank her. I never would have thought of it, he admitted, but somehow it was just what was needed for Lori. Celia was pleased that her daughter was pleased with her gift and made Frank promise to keep in touch and let her know how Lori and Bobby were doing. A few weeks later, Frank was paying his bills when Bobby's teacher called him one morning. I'd like to meet with you to talk about your son, the teacher told Frank. He's having discipline problems at school. Frank agreed to meet with her the next day, but decided not to say anything to Bobby that night. He wanted to wait until he knew what was going on before confronting his son. The meeting was scheduled for the next day after school while the children were in physical education. Mrs. Soldana, the home grade teacher, told the concerned father that Bobby's behavior in class had gotten worse over the past few months. At first, I didn't want to say anything because I know he's been through a lot, the teacher explained, but it seems to be getting worse. He's getting more and more distracted, not doing his homework, and the other teachers tell me that he's not paying attention in their classes. So far, he's always studied well, but this semester his grades will drop a lot if he doesn't do anything to change the situation. Frank was concerned. Do you think, Mrs. Soldana, how much does being a teenager have to do with it? No doubt it is a difficult age for children, especially boys, she told him, but we are used to it. I think his mother's death is affecting him more than he could tell you. Perhaps you should see a psychologist. Frank thanked the woman and returned to the car to anxiously wait for the kids to finish their gym class. He was upset to hear about Bobby's problems and was determined to have a long talk with the boy. When Frank brought Bobby and Lori home, he sent Lori to her room to start her homework and then led Bobby into the master bedroom. The boy's face darkened. He realized he was in trouble. Frank recounted his visit to Bobby's home teacher and gave some examples she had given him. What's going on, Bobby? Why are you acting like this? Demanded Frank. Just so, the boy replied sullenly. Come on, you're smarter than that, his father waved him off. Don't you care about your grades? Not really, Bobby muttered. Frank was annoyed by his son's unresponsiveness and in anger tried to shame him into responding. What would your mother think if she found out you blew it? Who cares? Shouted Bobby angrily back. She was such a slut. In shock and anger, Frank grabbed his son and yelled at him, Don't you ever talk about your mother like that! How can you say that? Frightened by his father's fury and the pain of his tight grip, the boy whispered, I saw her. I saw her doing it with that man. As soon as the words were off his lips, he collapsed on the bed and began to sob. In amazement, Frank sat down on the bed next to his son, put his arms around him, and cradled him as if he were a small child. It's all right, he repeated, trying to soothe the boy's obvious distress. When Bobby's crying subsided, Frank lifted his son's head. It's all right, Bobby. I'm not mad at you. Just tell me what you saw. His son looked at him with tears in his eyes. It was last fall. You let me ride my bike to school one day, but I forgot my math homework, so I sneaked home at lunchtime and took it. While I was looking for it in my room, I heard my mom come in. I didn't want her to catch me, so I hid. That's when I heard a man's voice. What man? Asked Frank a little too quickly. I don't know, Bobby said. Some guy. I've never seen him before. It's okay, Frank reassured him. Just tell me what happened next. They came in here and then it got quiet and I thought I could sneak out. But then I heard my mom make a funny sound and I got scared and I looked into the room and they were lying on the bed. The words came out of his mouth faster and faster, like he was desperate to spit them out, and when he was done, he burst into tears again. Why did she do that, Daddy? How could Mom act like such a slut? Listening to his son's story, Frank felt himself going numb. But he didn't have time to deal with his own emotions. His son needed him. I understand, Bobby. It's okay. I'm sorry you had to see that, but I'm glad you told me. He gently took his son by the shoulders and turned him around to face him. Sometimes people we love make mistakes or do something we don't like. It doesn't mean we don't love them anymore, just that we don't like what they did. I don't know why your mother did what she did, son, but I know she loved you and Lori very much. I want you to remember only good things about her. He hugged his son and continued to talk to him for a while longer. When he felt the boy had calmed down enough, he gently asked him to get started on his homework, and Frank went to the kitchen to make dinner. Before Bobby left, Frank asked him not to say anything to Lori. The boy promised, and Frank was sure he would keep the disturbing news from his sister. The rest of the evening passed without incident, but as soon as the children went to bed, Frank began to vent his emotions. His first reaction was to deny what Bobby had told him. His son must have been mistaken or misinterpreted what he had seen. But he couldn't stick to that logic for long. His son was too upset about what had happened. After this confession, Frank's thoughts turned bitter. How could Mary have betrayed him? He thought they had a solid marriage. How could she have been having fun with someone on the side? And anyway, who was that man and how long had the affair lasted? It's hard to lose your wife in a plane crash, he thought in despair. It's even worse to find out you lost her long before that. Sleep didn't come that night, and the next day Frank was in a black mood. It was Tuesday, the day he usually went to the gym, and after the kids had gone to school, he decided to continue his exercise routine. For a while, the exercise helped distract him, but when he sat down on the treadmill, his thoughts returned to his wife's infidelity. How could Mary do that? And in our own bed? He asked. Somehow the location made the betrayal all the more horrible. And how could she have known I wouldn't be home? But the answer came immediately. It must have been one of those days when I went to the gym. I'm such a habitual person that she was sure the house would be empty. But the answer to that question immediately spawned others. If she planned her little meeting to fit my schedule, it's not like it happened suddenly. How often did she meet with him? She couldn't have met him every week. Her travel schedule could have gotten in the way. Each question seemed to beget another, and each one only added to his misery. He tried his best to act normal around Bobby and Lori, but over the next few days he continued to suffer. He decided to go to the pharmacy to buy antacids. He'd never had stomach problems before. His misery was compounded by the fact that he had no one to talk to about his discovery. He certainly didn't want to tell his parents or Meredith. He knew the news would be devastating to them. Likewise, he didn't want to talk to his friends, risking becoming the subject of neighborhood gossip. And, he thought, I certainly don't want to risk any of my classmates teasing Bobby or Lori. He felt trapped. He was working at his desk one evening when he noticed Celia Murray's business card. She told me to call her if I had any more information, he remembered. But in truth, he was desperately looking for any excuse to share his news with someone and get another point of view. He called the cell phone number she'd written on the card, and when he introduced himself, Celia seemed pleased to hear from him. But her tone changed to concerned when he said he needed to talk to her. Are Lori and Bobby all right? She asked anxiously. They do, but I don't, he replied. Would you mind having lunch with me tomorrow? It's not something I want to discuss over the phone. She quickly agreed and suggested a place near the GBI office where she worked. It's a quiet place we can talk, she assured him. As he hung up the phone, Frank felt a little relieved at the prospect of talking. Celia was waiting in the restaurant when Frank appeared in the doorway. She smiled in greeting, but the smile quickly disappeared when she saw the distressed expression on his face. After they sat down at the table and ordered, she couldn't take it anymore. "For heaven's sake, Frank, what's wrong?" "You asked me to let you know if I had any more information about my wife," he said. "I don't know if it has anything to do with your investigation, but I just found out that Meredith has been cheating on me." As he said this, he was ashamed as tears flooded his eyes and streamed down his cheeks. Celia reached across the table and grabbed his hands. "Oh, Frank, this is terrible. Tell me what happened." The whole story of the meeting with Bobby's teacher, the confrontation with his son, and Bobby's painful revelation poured out, interrupted only by the appearance of food. Celia listened in silence, letting him narrate at his own pace. Only when he reached the end did she speak. "Poor Bobby," she said. "No wonder he behaves like that at school. It must have been festering him ever since it all happened. And then her death. No wonder he's so worried." She had let go of Frank's hands when the waitress brought their order, but now leaned across the table to reach for him again. "It's hard for me to imagine what this has done to you, Frank," she said quietly, and Frank saw the sympathy in her eyes. "Were there any signs that something was wrong, Frank?" "Now that you look back, did you notice any clues?" she asked. "No," he replied. "I can't say I saw anything." "You know what they say. The husband is always the last to know." He lowered his gaze to his untouched plate for a moment, then looked up at the woman again. "Ever since she got her big promotion, our sex life has gone downhill dramatically. But because of the pressures of her new role and travel schedule, I figured it was understandable. I didn't like it, but I felt I had to put up with it for the sake of our family. She kept telling me that things would get better when she moved to the national level, but," he paused, "that didn't seem destined to happen." Then he frowned. "It's killing me that I don't have any answers. I don't know what kind of bastard she was sleeping with. I don't know when their affair started or how long it lasted. I don't know if she was in love with this guy or if she was planning on leaving me. Worst of all, I don't know why she did this to me and the kids." Celia squeezed his hands. "Frank, please listen to me. The truth is, it's unlikely you'll ever get answers to your questions. You're going to have to forget about all of this. With her dead, none of it matters anymore. All you can do is focus on taking care of your family and yourself." "I know you're right," he said, "but it hurts so much to be betrayed like that. I think when she stopped loving me—" "No," said Celia fiercely, "you are wrong. No matter what happened, it's obvious that Meredith still cared deeply about you and the kids. Look what you learned at IMC. She bought maximum life insurance to make sure you were all protected. She maxed out her contributions to the 401k plan to put money aside for your future. I don't know what else has happened in her life, but it all looks like care to me." "Thank you, Celia. I'll try to remember that." When they got up to leave, he looked at the table. None of them had touched their food. "I guess I'm not a good choice for lunch," he remarked wryly. "Don't worry about it," she replied lightly. "Skipping a meal or two is probably good for me." Frank looked over her slender figure. "She looks pretty good to me," he thought. "It's been a long time," he said to himself regretfully. As they were walking out the door, she took his hand. "Please stay in touch, Frank, and let me know if there's anything I can do to help." "I'd really like to help." Then she reached up and kissed his cheek. As she turned away, Frank thought a blush appeared on her cheeks. Back at home, Frank was surprised to find his mood lightened. "I guess I really needed to talk it out," he said to himself. The following Saturday, Frank was in the yard picking up limbs that had fallen during a thunderstorm. When he entered the house, he saw Lori talking on the phone. He turned to Bobby, who was standing nearby. "Did someone call?" asked Frank. "No," Bobby replied dismissively. "She's just talking to her new best friend Celia." Frank was surprised. "Does she call Celia a lot?" "And what's a BFF?" "Oh, Dad," Bobby replied in despair. "You're totally off the mark. BFF is best friend forever." At that moment, Lori looked up and saw her father. "Daddy, can we take Celia to dinner?" "Let me talk to her," he said, holding out his hand to his daughter. When she handed him the phone, he said, "Hi, Celia, I think you heard that. Would you like to have dinner with Lori tonight?" Bobby and I will be here too. He heard her melodious laugh, followed by a quick agreement. Very well, he said. Why don't you come here about 6 o'clock? After they agreed, Frank hung up the phone and turned to his daughter. Well, here she comes, he said. I hope you'll be happy. Oh, yes, Daddy, she squeaked. Well, in that case, you and Bobby need to clean up the place so she doesn't think we're living like pigs. Oh, Daddy, do I have to? Complained Bobby. But before Frank could answer, the boy turned and began to gather up the clothes he had left in the room. He's still a teenager, Frank thought, but he seems to be getting better. Turning to head for the kitchen, Frank began to ponder what dish he should make. Definitely something better than spaghetti and meatballs, he thought, remembering the first time Celia had dined with them. He finally settled on the fish dish, which he considered one of his specialties. He was sure he could make it, and the kids liked it, which was always a plus. For that, he knew he would have to make a trip to the grocery store. After explaining his errand to Bobby and Lori, he told them to stay in the house until he returned. He found a nice piece of salmon in the seafood department, and then decided to pick up some dessert at the bakery. I should grab a nice bottle of wine, he thought, and directed his cart to the appropriate aisle. Once he found what he wanted, he looked in the floral section of the store and bought a bouquet for the table. On the way home, he thought about what he was doing. I'm really gorging myself on this food, he realized with surprise. Eventually, he decided it was because he owed Celia a good lunch. After all, I've ruined her lunch, he said to himself. Celia rang the doorbell at 6 o'clock, and before Frank could get to the door, Lori was already ushering her in. To Frank's amazement, even Bobby deigned to show up, and the teenager made polite conversation. Frank, for his part, felt a little awkward and inarticulate, but if Celia noticed it, she didn't show it in any way. Instead, she chatted cheerfully with Lori and willingly went with her to see what the girl wanted to show Celia in her room. By the time they reappeared, dinner was almost ready. The dinner was a great success. Celia was duly impressed by his culinary abilities. Oh, a man who can cook. Mother warned me about the likes of you, she teased, and the fact that he was clearly at ease with the children, both of whom chattered away in response to her questions. When dessert was finished, she insisted on joining in the cleanup, and with her help, the dishes were soon put away, rinsed, and put in the dishwasher to run later. At this point, Bobby excused himself to continue a video game he had paused, and Lori wanted to watch a favorite program she had videotaped, so the two adults filled their glasses with wine and went out into the living room. Frank, it was wonderful, Celia complimented him. I don't know when I've had such a good time. Thank you so much for inviting me. I don't think Lori would ever talk to me again if I didn't, Frank laughed, and Celia joined him. She's a wonderful girl and you're lucky to have her, she replied. And her father's doing a pretty good job, too. Frank felt his face redden. But then Celia's face took on a more serious expression. Frank, besides having a great time with you, I'm glad you invited me because I have some information I want to share with you. Frank caught the new intonation in her voice and looked at her curiously. This is very confidential, Frank, but I think I know you well enough to trust you. And it concerns you, at least indirectly. Now she had definitely gotten his attention. As you know, Celia began, the GBI was supposed to conduct a routine investigation before issuing your wife's death certificate. And as you also know, we found nothing that would give us a reason to refuse to issue a certificate that was properly issued. She took a deep breath and continued. Naturally, we did the same thing with John Collier, but we discovered a few oddities. First, it turned out that he was in financial trouble after a series of bad investment decisions. Frank nodded. What Celia had said matched what Amanda Collier had told him. Furthermore, over the past few weeks, Celia continued, IMC Security has informed us that they have discovered what appears to be significant irregularities in the Southeastern Accounting Department headed by John Collier. Even more disturbing, they believe they have uncovered a fraudulent billing scheme that may have resulted in the embezzlement of millions of dollars from IMC, and John Collier appears to have authorized it. Poor Amanda, Frank commented. She didn't deserve that. But then he began to consider what Celia had told him, and new possibilities opened before him. Could John Collier have had a hand in the disaster? He asked. Could it have been a way of covering his tracks? When Celia said nothing, Frank's imagination kicked into overdrive. What if Meredith found out about Collier's scheme? What if he killed her to silence her and used the plane crash to hide the evidence? Maybe he's still alive? Maybe he's hiding out in some villa by the sea and laughing at all of us? Take your time, Frank, Celia urged. You're getting carried away. The most likely scenario remains that the plane went down unexpectedly, as we've assumed all along. If Collier was really involved in the embezzlement scheme, the crash interrupted his plans. We'll explore all the possibilities, but we can't jump to conclusions, and neither should you. But Frank had a hard time shutting off his imagination. You don't think Meredith could have been involved, do you? He asked sharply. Celia sighed. It's not out of the question, she agreed, but we don't think it's likely. For one thing, if she was involved, it would mean she planned ahead of time to abandon her family. It's unusual for a mother to abandon her children, especially children their age, she said, gesturing to the children's rooms. Collier, on the other hand, had no children, and his wife reported that their marriage was on the verge of falling apart at the time of his disappearance. Moreover, unlike Collier, Meredith's finances were in perfect order, and prior to her disappearance, she had done nothing to suggest that she was involved in any plan, if indeed there was one. In fact, her actions were exactly the opposite of those of a person planning to disappear. But it's all just speculation. The only fact we have, Celia continued, is that Meredith's plane did indeed crash into the sea. She had hoped to reassure Frank, but when she looked at the man, she realized he was still upset by her revelations. Frank, you have to promise me that you won't say anything about any of this. It's very confidential, and if it gets out, it could jeopardize our investigation. It could also lead to my dismissal. This made Frank tense. He realized that Celia had taken a risk in confiding in him, and he was obliged to remain silent. I understand, Celia, and I promise I won't compromise your investigation. But I have to ask, why did you tell me all this? She looked at him seriously. It's unlikely, Frank, but there's always the possibility that you'll hear something or learn something that will help us shed some light on all this. If you do, Frank, promise me you'll get back to me right away. No Lone Rangers, please. He returned her gaze. I promise, Celia. Then he smiled. Besides, if I have to mess with you again, it won't be such a drag. The smile she gave him seemed to light up the entire room. Shortly afterwards, Celia had to leave. Before doing so, she said goodbye to Bobby and Lori. Frank noted that Bobby had interrupted his game to say goodnight to her, which was a real compliment from him. Lori walked her friend to the door again, snatching Celia's promise to call her. But this time, after Lori hugged her, Celia didn't fail to lean against the door and kiss Frank on the cheek. As she walked to her car, Lori looked at her dad and said, She likes you, Dad. Frank smiled at his daughter and pulled her close to him. Well, I like her too. When everyone had gone to bed and the house was quiet, Frank lay in his bed, thinking over what Celia had told him and all the different scenarios he had imagined. Oh, Mary, he thought, what have you gotten yourself into? Finally, he fell into a restless sleep. A week later, Frank was sitting at his computer and noticed something unusual. He was reading about some of his favorite sports teams, and as he was about to click on the Falcons tab, he noticed a Facebook icon right above it. On a whim, he clicked on it. Frank wasn't a Facebook follower. In fact, he rarely logged onto the site at all. The only reason he had an account was so he could keep track of his children. Bobby and Lori loved the social networking site and used it as another way to stay in touch with their friends. Frank didn't mind at first, but after reading a couple of scary articles about some of the pitfalls, he started his own account and insisted that Bobby and Lori add Bobby and Lori as friends. He also asked them to give him the passwords to their pages. That way, he reasoned, I'd be able to see all the messages and pictures they posted, as well as anything their friends sent them. More importantly, he thought, Bobby and Lori would know that he could spy on them, and that he hoped would encourage them to be discreet. When he logged onto his page, most of what he saw didn't interest him. But he did notice a friend request from someone he'd never heard of, Tom Thomason. The name seemed unfamiliar to him, and there was no photo, just a silhouette. When Frank clicked on the name, the stranger's page blandly informed him that personal information was only available to friends. Hey, Bobby, he called out. Do we know any Tom Thomason? His son walked into the room and saw his father browsing Facebook. Oh, that guy. Just ignore him, Dad. He's been talking me into adding him as a friend for weeks now. I just delete his requests. At that moment, Lori peeked into the room. Yeah, he tried to get me to friend him too. He's just some creep on Facebook. It was enough to get Frank's attention. Some unknown person wanted to make contact not only with him, but also with his children. Frank knew that there were all kinds of scammers out there, as well as some much scarier predators. He was alarmed, but didn't want to scare the children, so he only said, "You two did exactly the right thing," he assured them. "Never respond online to anyone you don't know well." As he searched for a way to protect his family, an unexpected idea occurred to him. Maybe Celia can help us find out who this creep Thomason is. He called her home, and she must have seen his name in the caller ID, because she answered warmly, "Hi, Frank." "Hi, Celia, I'm glad I caught you. Is there any chance you could come over? Something strange has come up, and I'd like to find out with you if you're free." "It's nothing serious, is it? Bobby and Lori are fine, aren't they?" As he comforted her, Frank couldn't help but notice that she seemed as concerned about his children as he was himself. It gave him a warm feeling. She told him she was working in the yard, but would be able to drive up in 45 minutes. To Frank's surprise, almost exactly the minute her car pulled up to the curb. With Mary, he remembered, he was lucky if she was no more than an hour late, trying to make her image perfect. But Celia arrived right on time, clearly freshly washed, dressed in a casual but attractive outfit, with neatly styled hair and fresh makeup. It was obvious that she had made an effort, even in such a short time. "You look good, Celia." "You didn't need to dress up for us," he told her. She squeezed his hand. "Thank you, Frank. I wanted it so much." Once she was in the house, Frank called his children over. As they noisily entered the room, he asked them to tell Celia about their potential Facebook friend. Bobby, as the official expert in the family, took the opportunity to brag, quickly logging into each of the family's 3 Facebook accounts in turn and receiving friend requests from the mysterious Tom Thomason. Praising Bobby's skill, Celia sat down in front of the screen and called up all the unread and archived messages, but couldn't find any additional information. Finally, she looked up at Bobby and Lori. The most likely answer is some sort of marketing ploy. If you accepted the request, you'd probably get all sorts of ads for junk you don't need or offers to buy imaginary gold from Nigeria. There are bad people in the world, and you should never let strangers know about you. Okay? Both children nodded solemnly, and Frank thought to himself that the message he had heard from Celia had probably had a stronger effect on them than when he had delivered it. While they were working on the computer, it was getting dark outside, and Frank knew his kids would be hungry soon. "Celia, we'll probably go out to dinner soon. It won't be anything fancy, just a family restaurant, but we'd love for you to join us if you can." As Frank had anticipated, Lori and even Bobby immediately began demanding that she come with them. She laughingly surrendered to the inevitable. The 4 of them piled into Frank's sedan and drove to a casual spot near their home. As they drove, Celia began asking the children about what she'd seen on their Facebook pages, and soon Lori and Bobby were eagerly talking about their friends and activities. Listening to the conversation, Frank wondered, Celia probably already knows more about what's going on in Lori and Bobby's lives than Mary ever did. He remembered that on the rare occasions they had gone out together before her death, Meredith's conversations had mostly revolved around her work. He felt guilty for his infidelity, but knew it was true. The lively conversation continued during dinner and the drive home, and Frank was delighted when Celia entered the house with them. The children immediately sat down in front of the television and asked Celia to watch with them, but she waved them off. "I need to talk to your daddy for a while." She took his hand and led him into the living room. After they sat down, her face became serious and she said, "I didn't want to alarm Bobby and Lori, but I don't think those Facebook requests were a marketing ploy. The Bureau has received alerts about some identity theft scams, but they usually don't target children. To me, it looks like someone is purposely trying to get your family's information." The thought of his children being in danger sent a chill through Frank. Who could it be? What could they possibly want? "I don't know, Frank," she replied. "This is unlike any cyber fraud model I've seen before." "What can we do? Close their Facebook accounts? Maybe keep them off the net altogether?" She looked thoughtful. "I don't think it's necessary, provided they're careful not to communicate with strangers." And if they get nonsense emails with embedded websites, warn them never to click on the links. She thought for a moment longer, then spoke. The problem with the internet is that it's so amorphous. You can't tell who you're dealing with or where they are. But it's not as opaque as a lot of people think. I have a friend in the federal government who might be able to help us. He probably won't be able to find out who Tom Thomason is, but he might be able to tell us where he lives. Let me call on Monday and let you know what I find out. With those words, she got up and went to her room to say goodnight to the two children. When she returned, Frank walked her to the door, but before she opened it, he hugged her. "You've been like a guardian angel to us," he said sincerely. "I don't know what we would have done without you." She looked into his eyes for a moment and then kissed him quickly on the lips. "I don't know if I want to be an angel," she said with a wink. "They don't have much fun." She then turned and walked quickly to her car, leaving Frank standing there bewildered. True to her word, Celia called Frank late Monday morning. "Do you know anyone in Palm Beach, Florida?" she asked. "Not a soul," Frank replied. "Whoever Tom Thomason is, he created his Facebook account with a zip code starting with 334, so he's somewhere in Palm Beach County," she said. "I can't imagine why someone in Palm Beach would try to contact us," Frank said, "but at least he's not around." "That's reassuring." "I agree," Celia said. "Besides, we've been tracking a lot of scams in South Florida, so maybe this really is some new kind of internet scam. Just make sure Bobby and Lori have nothing to do with these friend requests." "I will, Celia, and thank you. I feel so much better about the whole thing." "I'm so glad I could help, Frank." In spite of what he had said to Celia, Frank was not in the least reassured. On the contrary, it seemed to him that he and his children were under continuous attack. First came the terrible news of Meredith's death. Then poor Bobby confessed that his wife had cheated on him. Then he got word that Mary might have been involved in some fraudulent business dealings before her death. And now some unknown person was trying to get information about his children. Frank felt like they were under siege, and he decided he would fight back. His first priority was to find the enemy in Palm Beach County and confront him. But how could he do that? A cursory internet search showed that the county had a population of 1.3 million. Looking for Tom Thomason would be like looking for a short stick in tall grass. Besides, Frank thought, it was just as likely that the name could be a fake. Frank's ordered mind continued to beat over the problem. Then an idea struck him. If I can't find Thomason, maybe I can get him to find me. A plan began to form in his mind. The chances are slim, he admitted, but it's all I've got. The first thing he needed to do was to get Bobby and Lori out of the way. It was almost time for summer vacation, and that gave Frank an idea. He dialed his in-laws' number. "Dad, would you and Mom like Bobby and Lori to come visit us for a week? I'll need to go out of town during that time, so you'd be a big help." When the children's grandfather happily agreed and all the issues surrounding their stay were resolved, Frank hung up the phone and immediately called Delta. "I'd like to book a flight to Palm Beach." His children welcomed the news of their upcoming visit to their grandparents, but their enthusiasm waned when they learned that their father would not be traveling with them. It would be the first time they would be separated since their mother's death, and the prospect brought back the fear of abandonment they had felt since then. Frank hated to cause the children any distress, but he felt that he must do what he intended, and he succeeded in persuading them. A week before their visit began, Frank began to be plagued by doubts. "Am I doing the right thing?" he asked himself. But despite the uncertainty, the thought of doing nothing was worse. His inner turmoil was briefly interrupted by a phone call from Celia, who called to inquire how he and his family were doing. After a few minutes of conversation, the tone of her voice changed slightly, and Frank thought she sounded almost shy. "I was wondering if you wanted to get together next week." "I haven't seen you and the kids in a while, and—" Her voice trailed off uncertainly. "I'd love to do that, Celia, but then I'm taking the kids to their grandparents." "We'll be gone all week." "Oh," she said, "I understand. Maybe some other time." "I'd like that very much, Celia," he said fervently. Frank felt bad about lying to Celia about his plans, but he told himself, at least it was partly true. Besides, he was sure he knew what she would say if he revealed his true plans. When Frank returned home and took the children to his relatives in the village, he immediately sat down at the family computer. One of the reasons he asked Meredith's family to take his children was that he knew they didn't have a computer. So he felt safe logging on to Lori's Facebook. Sure enough, a friendship request came in from Tom Thomason. Frank clicked on the accept option and quickly received confirmation that Lori was now friends with this stranger. If nothing comes of this, Frank thought, I'll just unsubscribe from him later. Next came the hardest part, pretending to be a 12-year-old girl. He studied his daughter's previous messages and decided that he could imitate her style quite well. I may not be able to fool her friends, he admitted to himself, but I hope I can fool Tom Thomason. He decided that his first communication should lay the foundation and wrote a short note of his visit to the country, Lori. Just a little news for her friends, thought Frank, nothing to arouse the suspicions of the lurkers. The next day he planned to set a trap. OMG, I'm going to Florida. My best friend Celia offered to take me with her and my dad agreed. Flying out tomorrow, can't wait. Frank decided to call Celia by her first name because it seemed to him that neither Lori's friends nor Tom Thomason knew her. He hoped Celia wouldn't mind. Now that the lure was in the water, Frank hoped he could jiggle it enough to get the fish's attention. I can't believe I'm in Palm Beach. That's to die for. In the evening, Frank posted the following piece. Spent the day at the beach. I'm going to be so tan. The next morning, Frank posted a note that he hoped would catch on. I'm going back to the beach tonight. Tomorrow, Celia's taking me shopping on Worth Avenue. We'll have lunch at Tabu's. Too coola. As soon as the entry appeared on Lori's page, Frank headed to Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. Soon he was already settled in his seat for the 2-hour flight to Palm Beach. Looking out the window, he remembered that he had been to Palm Beach once before. In fact, he and Mary had driven through town on their way back from their honeymoon in Miami Beach. They'd driven over the Lake Worth Bridge and then traveled down Southern Ocean Boulevard, admiring the mansions overlooking the Atlantic. After landing, Frank rented a car and drove to the motel in West Palm Beach where he had booked a room. There was a fast food restaurant across the street, and he grabbed a sandwich and a Coke, which he ate in the room while studying a map of the city on his laptop. He hoped he was doing the right thing. After breakfast, he checked Lori's Facebook page, but found only a few envious replies from her classmates. He didn't expect Thomason to contact him, but he hoped his fishing expedition might find something. Around 10 a.m., he got in his car and drove east over the Royal Park Bridge, turned south, and then east again to Worth Avenue. He wanted to be there early, and he needed to park the car on the street so he could get there quickly if necessary. After driving around the block where the restaurant was several times, he was beginning to wonder if he had miscalculated. But suddenly a car pulled out in front of him, and he was able to pull into the parking space. Setting the meter down, he walked down the street in front of the restaurant. Noticing a bench in the shade, he gratefully took a seat on it. He grabbed his baseball cap and sunglasses and put them on, hoping to disguise himself. Then he pulled out a copy of the Palm Beach Post and pretended to read while looking around the street. As he sat there, the realization of how flimsy his plan was slowly began to set in. He had no idea if the mysterious Tom Thomason had seen the fake posts on Lori's Facebook page and would show up in response. Worse, Frank had no idea who he was looking for. Unless the mystery man turned out to be John Collier, which Frank thought was unlikely, how would he be able to recognize the threat? All he could hope for was to spot the suspicious man, whatever that meant, and come face to face with him. The street was crowded, and Frank kept trying to keep track of all the passers-by. The restaurant was starting to fill up, and his stomach rumbled as he watched the people coming in. He cursed himself for not thinking to bring a sandwich, but he didn't dare leave his post. Time stretched slowly as he sat there, and after a while he saw the crowd in the restaurant begin to thin. Glancing at his watch, he realized it was over an hour later. What an idiot, he thought. I wouldn't be any worse off if I stayed home, and at least I could see Celia again. While he was looking at the shoppers passing by, a woman strolling across the street caught his eye. Here I go again, Frank thought, seeing Mary in a crowd of strangers. In fact, he noted, the woman looked nothing like Meredith at all. Meredith had shoulder-length brunette hair, and this woman was a blonde with a short haircut. And her clothes were different from anything Frank had ever seen Meredith wear. But there was something eerily familiar about her, and as he continued to watch her, Frank realized that it was her gait that had triggered his reaction. He impulsively got up and followed her. Glancing down the street, he saw that the blonde had reached the corner and was trying to hail a cab. Risking his life, Frank ran across Worth Avenue and jumped into the car. Just as he pulled away from the curb, he saw the woman climb into the back seat of the cab and race down the avenue toward the Atlantic. Before reaching Southern Ocean Boulevard, the cab turned left onto County Road and headed north. Frank followed it for some distance. Finally, he saw that the cab turned left onto a suburban street and kept going until it got almost to Lake Worth. Frank stopped the car at the curb about a soccer field away and watched as the woman paid the driver and then entered an elegant house that faced the lake. Frank squinted his eyes, trying to get a good look at her. With her hair color and short cut, she looked nothing like Mary. But she was the same height and weight, and as she walked down the path toward the house, Frank was again amazed at her gait. Sitting in the car, Frank suddenly remembered a book he had read a long time ago. In the story, an actor needed a disguise. But instead of a false mustache or wig, he just put pebbles in his shoes. "If someone sees me," the actor told his friend, "they'll say, 'Looks like that guy, but it's not him,' because I'll walk differently." It works the other way too, thought Frank. As he recalled the book, the certainty grew in him that he had just seen his deceased wife. Trying to hold back his growing anger, he ran down the street and walked to the door. He rang the doorbell and crossed his arms and waited. Opening the door, the woman looked at him with a perplexed look. Then she did a double take and shrieked, "Frank, what are you doing here?" "Hello, Mary. Funny to meet you here," he said sarcastically. After a moment's hesitation, she spread her arms to hug him, but he quickly raised his hands to stop her. "Don't touch me!" he growled. Then, unable to contain his anger any longer, he shouted, "How could you do this to me? How could you leave Bobby and Lori?" Throwing an anxious glance outside, Meredith grabbed his arm and dragged him into the house, slamming the door behind her. "I did it all for you, baby, for you and the kids," she urged. "You have to believe me. It was the only way out." As she spoke, every now and then she looked around nervously. "What the hell are you talking about?" demanded Frank hotly. "You're missing the point. None of this makes any sense." "Sit down, little one," she coaxed him. "You have to let me explain everything." She was still speaking loudly and rubbed her hands together nervously, sitting down and urging him on. When Frank sat down, an icy calm descended upon him. "Okay, Mary, I'm listening." "I was so close to it, baby. I had a coveted big job in my pocket, but then the damn economy went down. I knew if I could get a little more bang for the buck in the region, the economy would recover and the promotion would be secured." She smiled pleadingly and held out her palms to her husband. "And Frank, once I got this job, we'd be on Easy Street. No worries about paying for college for the kids, no worries about retirement, no worries ever again." Frank could barely contain himself. Was it all about money and Mary's position in the company? Meredith's hands rested on her lap again. "So John and I?" "John Collier," said Frank grimly. "Yes," she continued, not catching his mood. "You've met him. Anyway, he and I figured out a way to move a few sales from our biggest accounts. We knew they'd show up eventually. We just booked them earlier, in the current quarter. Every other region was reporting a significant decrease in sales, and we had a significant increase. The corporation was just thrilled. We earned the biggest bonuses the company has ever paid," she says proudly. Then the smile slid off her face like a cloth falling to the floor. But the economy was getting worse, not better. And when John told me it would all come out eventually, I knew we had to do something about it. We knew we'd need a lot of money to pull this thing off, so John created a dummy vendor account and started sending fake invoices to IMC. They're so sloppy and wasteful over there, they didn't even notice. "So you were planning to fake your death in a plane crash to cover your tracks?" asked Frank. "That's right, kid," she said, as if Frank was her star pupil. "With enough money, it's not hard to get someone to leave a Zodiac motorboat with a GPS signal in the Caribbean. We just homed in on the signal and landed right next to it." "So this whole thing was just a way to steal a lot of money and abandon the family?" asked John bitterly. "No, baby," she protested. "That's not it at all. I knew I'd have to get out of sight for a while, but I made sure you and the kids were okay. I took out life insurance and put everything I could into my 401k so you guys would have plenty of money," she said proudly. And you thought having enough money would make up for the loss of my wife and the mother of our children? This time she heard his bitterness. No, baby, no. You don't understand. I was going to come back for you. As soon as things settled down, I was going to contact you. We could go somewhere safe, baby. We could be together. As she spoke, her eyes continued to dart around the room. Frank looked at her with a stony stare. You're only missing one thing, he said in an even voice. What is it, baby? She asked. You forgot about having fun with John Collier, he said. She was scared at first, but then she stood up and held out her arms to him. No, baby, it wasn't like that. John and I just worked together. We were never more than co-workers. Don't lie to me, Meredith, Frank snapped back. Bobby saw you two together in our bedroom. She sighed. God, did Bobby see us? Oh, that's awful. A sob caught in her throat, but then she came to her senses and straightened up again. It was just one time, baby. He said he wouldn't help me unless I gave myself to him. But it was just one time, I swear. Frank stood up. Ignoring her, he looked around. Come out, John, he said loudly. I know you're out here somewhere. Meredith continued to wail. No, baby, it's just me. It was just one time. But no sooner had she continued than John Collier appeared from the bedroom. He was wearing a robe and had his hands in his pockets. Lay off, Mary, he knows, Collier muttered. Though he guessed they lived together, hearing Collier use his wife's favorite name made Frank wince. Meredith began to cry. He must have found us through Facebook, Collier grumbled. I warned you, but you just had to check your two offspring. Then his tone changed to cold and hard. But that doesn't matter now. We need to get out of here. He turned to Frank and pulled an automatic rifle from his robe pocket, which he pointed in Frank's direction. As for you, bright boy, you're the only one who knows we're still alive. No, John, no, screamed Meredith, but Collier ignored her. Looks like your kids are going to lose not only their daddy, but their mommy too, he said with a chuckle, raising his gun at Frank. I wouldn't do that if I were you, came a voice from the hallway. All three turned around in amazement and saw the figure of Celia Murray appear in front of them, holding a Smith & Wesson automatic at Collier's throat. Before Collier could react, a second voice came from behind him. Drop the gun, Collier! It's over! Special Agent Harold Barnes emerged from the kitchen, his gun also pointed at Collier. The former head of the accounting department looked at the two agents hostilely, but then his shoulders slumped. He dropped the gun to the carpet and slowly raised his hands. While Barnes held the gun at gunpoint, Celia quickly went behind the sullen man and twisted one of his arms behind his back, snapping handcuffs around his wrist. She then slid the other arm down and snapped the second handcuff. After securing Collier, she repeated the procedure with Meredith. As the two lay on the floor, Barnes made a cell phone call to the Palm Beach Police Department. A second call went to the local FBI office. A short time later, the house was crowded with uniformed and plainclothes police officers. Frank just stood back, looking dumbfounded at what was happening. As the fugitives were led away, Frank scrutinized them both. Collier was muttering to himself. Meredith was crying. Neither looked in Frank's direction. When they left, Celia walked over to Barnes, hugged him, and kissed him on the cheek. Thank you for coming with me, partner. I owe you a great debt of gratitude. The senior agent smiled. No, you don't owe me anything. Solving this case will reflect very well in our personal affairs. When Barnes left, Celia finally looked at Frank. To his amazement, she walked over to him, put her arms around his neck, and sobbed. You big idiot, don't you ever do that to me again. You could have killed yourself. He held her tightly until her crying subsided. Then he pulled her away from him enough that he could look into her face. What are you doing here? He asked. How did you know where to find me? She smiled through her tears. Lori called me to chat. When she told me you weren't with them at their grandparents' house, I suspected you were going to do something stupid and started making inquiries. When I saw her Facebook posts, I called the airline and found out that you had booked a flight to Palm Beach. I talked Harold into coming with me, and we've been following you since first thing in the morning. She shook her head. We almost lost you when you took off after that cab, but Harold guessed which way you turned and was right. Frank pulled her even tighter against him. I guess you really are my guardian angel, he said and kissed her. 2 years later, Frank pulled the collar of his coat tighter around his neck. The humidity was high as always, and the wind off Puget Sound was cold and damp. Still, Frank thought, it feels good to be here. The last 2 years had been difficult in many ways. If it was a terrible shock for Frank to discover that his wife was alive, the consequences were even worse for Bobby and Lori. The fact that she went to trial and was convicted of numerous criminal charges only added to the family's pain. During the inevitable media hype surrounding the arrest and trial, Frank feared his children would not make it through. The divorce was a mere formality. Legally, Meredith could no longer be dead, but she would spend the next 12 years of her life in Arendelle State Prison. The International Marketing Corporation, of course, demanded that Frank return not only Meredith's life insurance policy, but also most of her 401k, since it was funded by bonuses she hadn't earned. As the innocent party, Frank may have had reason to keep some of the funds, but he wanted nothing to do with any part of his ex-wife's money. Instead, he began urgently looking for work, as his family's savings were nearly depleted. The offer he received from a large aerospace company was coveted not only because it would provide for his family, but also because it meant moving across the country. There were too many reminders of Meredith in Atlanta, and too many questions from friends and others that he and his children couldn't answer. Finding a new place to live and work seemed like the best solution for all of them. Frank didn't want to leave the state where he and his children were born, but he was ready to embrace the Pacific Northwest and start a new life. They were lucky enough to sell the house in Atlanta and were able to buy a nice, albeit slightly smaller house in Seattle. Meredith had always wanted to live in a luxurious house, and Frank was happy with something more cozy. The kids seemed to like it too, and they were already making friends at the new school. He walked in from the deck and looked around for his car keys. Finding them, he poked his head into the kitchen to look for his wife. "Come on, Angel, let's go get our kids." Celia smiled happily at him. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. So subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.